So this is Chapter 2, Section 1, Notes Part 2, Take 3. I've been having a few problems with the display here, so let's see if we can get those worked out. Alright, so we left off discussing that each colony had their own independent quirks, different things. Qualifications for voting were pretty strict, things like that. But written constitutions were also a key feature of the colonial period. And the first example we have here is an informal written constitution called the Mayflower Compact. And this was something that was signed on the Mayflower when some of the eventual colonists were coming from Europe to the colonies here in the United States. And it was the very first example of self-government plans. When this Mayflower Compact had outlined who would be in charge, who would have certain powers, who would do what, all kinds of things. Pretty much everything you would expect from a modern-day constitution, just very, very informal, very vague, very broad. But it was used as the basis for a lot of the other earlier constitutions, such as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which we will talk to in just a quick second. In 1636, colony in Plymouth adopted the General Fundamentals. And the General Fundamentals are the first basic system of laws in the colonies. Excuse me. So this would be similar to what you would find in the state of Ohio with the Ohio Revised Codes or the Federal Penal Codes for the nation, or the national government, excuse me. So they were basically the first system of laws, which you could not do. Now, one thing I do not want you to get confused on here is constitutions and laws. The biggest difference is constitutions tell you what you can do, what you have the right to do, and how the government is structured. Laws tell you what you cannot do, what you are not allowed to do, the rights you do not have, and it does not outline the structure of the government. It is simply what you cannot do for laws and what you can do for constitutions. So 3 years after the General Fundamentals were adopted in Plymouth in 1639, Puritans left Massachusetts Bay because they wanted to draw up their first formal constitution. And they did this in the colony of Connecticut, and they called their first formal constitution, which outlined the structure of government, the Fundamental Orders of, you guessed it, Connecticut. So this was America's first formal constitution, and it differed from the Mayflower Compact in a few ways, but primarily that it was very well structured, very well written out. Each piece of government or each branch of government had their specific purpose and what they were to do, what they were not to do. And most importantly, it laid out the plan for government and gave the people the power to elect their representatives. The power to elect representatives in the colonies was extremely important. If you haven't figured it out yet, the American Revolution was primarily fought because we did not have the power to elect our representatives. So please keep that in mind, that representative government is absolutely key when discussing the beginnings of the United States government and Constitution. Now I'm going to move through these fairly quickly, so if you feel like you need to pause this at any moment and write down what's on the screen, that's totally fine. Just pause it and join right back in. So soon after the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, other colonies said, hey, we want the power to elect our own representatives. So they drew it up in their own constitutions. The first legislature in the United States was something called the Virginia House of Burgess. And the Virginia House of Burgess was extremely important here in the United States because it's the basis of all legislatures that we've had in the U.S. and most closely resembles our House of Representatives in the United States Congress today, with representatives being assigned by population in the state of Virginia. In 1636, some of those Puritans again in Massachusetts, they told their leaders, hey, we need to reorganize our government so that each town in Massachusetts gets 2 representatives sent to the legislative branch for the state government of Massachusetts. And this is huge. And some of you may be saying, why is this huge? Why in the world are you even telling us about this? The reason I'm telling you about this is because that structure of having equal representation, no matter how many people lived in your town, is the same structure that we have currently in the United States Senate, the upper house of the United States Congress, where we have 2 representatives from each state, regardless of the population of that state. Every state gets 2. So there are 100 senators exactly. And by the mid-1700s, representative government was an established tradition in America. It was a no-brainer. I mean, this is from 1740s to 1750, so dating back to that first legislature, the Virginia House of Burgess in 1619, I mean, there was no one alive at the time of the American Revolution that didn't practice and know exactly what representative government was. So the idea that the United States perfected the representative government isn't exactly true, but we did do a pretty good job at moving it towards a more fair system where the power was split more equally in a separation of powers format. So in the colonies, this was sort of a new thing. This had never been done before. So these colonies had to make new laws all the time to deal with new circumstances that were coming up, because in England, all these public buildings existed and public schools existed and court systems existed. In the colonies, they didn't. We had to build them from scratch. So we had to make new laws to deal with building public buildings such as town halls and police stations and eventually fire stations and things like that. Building schools so that our children could be educated, and developing court systems that were fair and equal to all, unlike what had happened in Great Britain before. And the most important thing about these legislatures that we've been discussing are that they are examples of something called the consent of the governed. And what that means is the people that are subject to those laws are the ones that have to say yes or no, whether they are going to be a law or not. It's not just someone with power telling you what to do. It is you telling the people who you gave power to, yes, you can hold me to that, or no, you can't, and it's stupid. And this works better if we have large numbers of people come out to vote, because the more people we have come out to vote, the more accurate our voting results are. So if there's 1 million people that can vote and only 1,000 of them come out, our data could be skewed. It could not be correct. Someone who is not what the majority or the plurality of people want could win, versus if we had 1 million people who could vote and 900,000 of them showed up to vote, our results most likely are going to reflect accurately what the majority or plurality of voters did want. So the idea that we have to say yes or no to the laws, and that large numbers of people needed to show up to do this, were 2 ways that we made sure that the laws were, in fact, what the people and what the citizens truly wanted. So back to separation of powers. There was a basic separation of power structure in every colony, but it basically came down to this. There was a governor who the king, King George, if you care, and the legislature is elected by the colonists, and that was it. But all of the power truly remained with that governor. The governor could pretty much do whatever they wanted. And those legislatures were more of a way to kind of tell the colonists, here you go, we'll let you elect some representatives. We won't give you any actual real power. And this sort of upset the colonists. They were really appalled by this. They said, we want some true power. We don't want you to be able to tell us what to do without us having a say in that. And that's why the separation of powers was so vital to the United States Constitution. They did not want to just repeat what had been done to them to other colonists. So the idea that they should take the ability to pass laws and give it to the legislative branch, like they do currently in the United States. The president has no power whatsoever over what bills are brought to Congress and whether they are passed or not. The only power the president has is whether to sign that bill into law or to veto that bill. And that's it. So the president does have a little bit of power when it comes into lawmaking, but it's very small. Lawmaking is usually primarily set to the legislative branch. And so the only check, or the only way the president can say yes or no, is to veto that bill. We also have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, who can take that law and basically they interpret it against the United States Constitution. And they either say, yes, this law is constitutional, it can stay, or no, this law is not constitutional and it has to go. And it becomes null and void the very minute that the Supreme Court says it is unconstitutional. So these colonial legislatures, they sort of were a training ground for some of our founding fathers and the framers of the United States Constitution. And some of these people George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and John Hancock. But there are a few people you probably don't know. Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, different people that had a pretty big hand in what happened in the American Revolution that you just don't know right off the top of your head like you do some of those others. And so this gave them the opportunity to sort of figure out what the people actually wanted, learn how to be politicians, and learn how to run a government effectively before declaring our independence from Great Britain. So their combination of English heritage, where they came from, these ideas of limited government and representative government, they brought with them into this new mix of colonial experiences where people were upset that they were not having representation in their government and that they were being taxed unfairly or treated unfairly, or they were not being guaranteed the English Bill of Rights, those 5 things we talked about in part 1 video. Excuse me. And this really gave them the understanding of, number 1, how their enemy's government function, and number 2, that all governments didn't have to function that way and that there was a better way to do that. And this gave them exactly what they needed to lead a successful revolution against the English and the British government and create what we know today as the United States of America. I hope you enjoyed watching this. This is the end of Chapter 2, Section 1, Notes, Part 2, and I hope you enjoyed watching. We'll see you later.